All right, we are back, and in this one, we're going to be talking about scope of a variable, and ultimately, we're going to code max of 2 and then modify or create a new one called max of 3. Max of 2, not super challenging. Max of 3, very challenging, as it turns out. Sit tight. So, the introduction of if and if else statements means that our programs can consist of multiple bodies other than the class body and the main method body. So, traditionally, we just had the class body, and the only thing that we put in that was the main method, and then almost everything just appears in the main method body. But even now, with our if and if else statements, we're going to have bodies inside of the main method body, right? We've been nesting and nesting and nesting. So, with that, the scope of a variable becomes an issue that demands attention. What we're talking about here is the region in a program in which a variable exists and can be accessed or modified. Recall that the process of declaring a variable and the process of assigning it a value are two different concepts. We're going to do this most frequently. We're going to declare the variable and give it a value all in the same step. But keep in mind that this can actually be broken apart. We rarely do this. We rarely create the variable and then assign it a value later. But what I want you to understand is what we're talking about is the scope coincides with where the variable is declared. Okay? This is actually two different steps, right? We have variable declaration on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side with our equal sign here, we're actually assigning it a value. That can be broken apart. A variable scope coincides with the body it is declared in. Okay? So let's look at some examples that are a little bit kind of familiar to us. Right? Here I just have the main method. Here on this line we create a scanner. We're declaring the scanner and initializing it, right? We're assigning it a value. Input is going to exist starting here. Input being this scanner variable. I then prompt the user. I then declare a variable x and assign it a value. So input starts existing on this line. X starts existing on this line. They are both declared in the body of the main method, which means whenever the main method body ends, that's when they stop existing. Okay, not a big deal because we've been working almost exclusively in the main method. However, consider the if statement. I have my main method, right? Its body is designated by the opening and closing brace. I have this if statement, and its body is declared by this opening and closing brace. Okay, well, what if I were to declare a variable inside of the if statement, right? This is being declared inside the body of the if statement, which means it exists until the body of the if statement no longer exists. Right? So this is the closing brace for my if statement, and x stops existing there. Where this is kind of a big deal is if you try to access it. Right? Let's take a bigger look here. We have our if else statement. X is declared inside of the if statement. It only exists in the if statement. Inside my else, I have y, which exists, and it only exists inside of that else statement. Okay, if we attempt to access or modify a variable outside of its scope, that will result in a syntax error. Because x is declared inside of this if statement and stops existing whenever the if statement stops, if I try to access x outside of that body, it doesn't exist. Right? X exists inside of this scope, inside of the scope of the if statement. That's what we're talking about here. However, you can broaden the scope of a variable by declaring it in an outer body, as the variable scope will overlap into inner bodies. What am I saying? Well, what if instead of declaring x inside of the if statement, we declared it inside of the main method? A very subtle change, but a big deal. X is declared in the body of the main method, which means it'll stop existing when the main method stops. What that means is its scope is going to overlap into any of these bodies, including this if statement. So inside of the if statement, I am actually assigning x the value. Right? That's perfectly fine. X can be accessed and modified because its scope is going to overlap into this if statement. Okay, because x continues to exist for the entirety of the main method, I could print it off afterwards, and that's perfectly fine. That's inside the scope of x. Okay, if we come in here with an if-else statement, right, its scope is going to overlap into the if statement. Its scope is going to overlap into the else statement. And then X can still be modified, accessed and modified inside the main method. In this case, I'm just printing it off. Okay. Note that variables within the same scope must have unique names. What do I mean? Well, here I've declared X inside the body of the main method. It'll stop existing when the main method stops. Its scope is going to overlap into this if statement. In the if statement, I'm trying to declare another X. Well, that's a problem. X already exists in that scope, so we can't recreate X and give it a value. So this little subtle int right here is actually a problem. Lastly, don't forget to assign values to variables before trying to access them. Attempting to access a variable that has no value will result in a syntax error. If we're going to be declaring variables at different spots and letting their scope overlap, well, you got to kind of keep track of them. Here I've declared X inside of the main method, but I never actually give it a value. As you can imagine, here I just have an if statement, but what if there's like a lot of code here, several hundred lines of code, and then later on I try to access X, I try to print it. Well, I just never gave it a value. Okay, this is usually not a super big problem with us because we're usually assigning values the moment we declare, but I just want you to keep in mind that variable declaration is its own concept. This is distinct from declaring and initializing, right? You can declare a variable, and that's what's important when it comes to scope. Okay, with that in mind, let's determine the max of 2. I want to write a program, max of 2, that prompts the user to enter 2 numbers, doubles, and then prints the larger of the 2 without using Math.max. Now, Math.max exists. I told you about it. But I want you to think about this. Somebody wrote this. Somebody wrote Math.max. How did they accomplish it? Well, they're using the same stuff that you and I are limited to, right? They just use Java in order to program this method, Math.max, this command. So let's create this program. This will probably be a good spot that if you kind of know what you are doing, you want to attempt this on your own, you can go right ahead. I'm going to create my new project. I need to jump to my principles folder, but you're likely okay. I'm going to create max of 2. I'm going to expand my project folder, right click on the SRC, do a new Java class called max of 2. I'm going to plug in my main method, and the first thing I want to do is actually get scanner, because as our prompt says, we want to ask the user for 2 numbers, 2 doubles, and determine what is the larger of the 2. Now there's 4 steps to implementing scanner. We're going to speed it up a little bit. We're going to use IntelliJ to our advantage, and I'm actually going to jump to step 2 of implementing scanner. I'm going to start to type out scanner right here, and here this is called IntelliSense. That's not an IntelliJ exclusive word that exists across all IDEs, but it is sensing intelligently what we are typing. In this case, I'm trying to type out scanner. Right? I'm trying to do step 2, which is create my scanner object. And there's some suggestions here based on what I've typed so far. And the top one says scanner java.util. Well, that's actually exactly what I want. So I'm going to hit enter on that. And IntelliJ is going to add the import statement and finish out my scanner expression here. Okay, I'm going to back that up. Right here, I'm typing out scanner. The IntelliSense is sensing what I'm typing, offering some suggestions. The top being scanner coming out of java.util. Well, I'm going to hit enter on that, and it's going to import it. Now, something else you could do is, what if you typed out the whole word, right? You got just an insane words per minute. You're not even thinking. You're already at this step. Well, I'm well past the IntelliSense. But if you hover over this, right, it says it can't resolve it. But it also is offering some suggestions. You could directly import the class with Alt-Shift-Enter, or more actions. I'm actually going to hit this more actions and just kind of see what it's giving us. We could create it. But the top one says import class, and so I'm going to hit enter on that, and again, we can import it. So if you manage to skip the IntelliSense, there's still options on how to bring that in. So step 2 is scanner. I'm going to create my scanner object. I'm going to prompt the user, right? We're going to say, please enter a double. Maybe the big brain thing here is to tell them what the program does. This program determines the maximum of 2 doubles. Please enter the first double. Right, this prompt makes a little bit more sense if I kind of give them a heads up on what's happening here. So I'm going to get that double. X is fine. And then I'm going to grab these 2 bad boys with a little copy and paste. And we'll do that. All right, this program determines the maximum of 2 doubles. Please enter the first double. The user is going to give us that. Please enter the second double. So we're saving those into X and Y. I actually have 3 variables here, all of them declared in the body of the main method. Right, we have a scanner input. It stops existing here. We have a double X. It stops existing here. And we have a double Y. It stops existing here. Now, the question, once we start kind of talking about scope, and I'm pointing out variables inside the main method, is can we declare variables in the body of the class? The answer is yes, and that's more important to us later on in CSA, the follow-up course to this. Okay, so I'm getting 2 doubles from the user. I want to determine the max. Now, you could just use Math.max, but the people that wrote Math.max had to add some logic. So using if statements, we can actually figure out what is the maximum of these 2, right? So I can come in here with an if statement and say, simply put, if X is greater than Y, that's the maximum. Right, so here we see our syntax of our if statement. If X is greater than Y, that means that X is the larger value. So maybe I print off some type of statement that says, I don't know, max along with our X. Otherwise, if I hit this else, what does that actually mean? Well, that means that Y is greater than or equal to X. Now, you may be asking the question, well, what if they're equal? Do we need like a separate equals for that? But I want you to think about what Math.max does. Why don't we finish this out? We'll talk about that. The way that Math.max handles it, right? What am I talking about? Math.max. The way that Math.max would handle this is, if in the event that they're equal, is you would just get one of the values. It doesn't matter which one you give. In our case, the value that we'll end up giving them is Y. But it doesn't matter. They're the same. It doesn't matter. Okay, so let's try out what we got going on here. I'm going to get values from the user. If X is the largest, we'll print it off. Otherwise, well, that must mean that Y is the largest, so we'll print this off. In the event that they're equal, we're technically giving them Y. We're technically hitting this else, and that's okay. I'm going to right-click and free space, tell my program to run. All right, please enter the first double. I don't know, 3, 7. Well, 7 is the largest. Notice that I entered effectively integers. Well, they're getting saved as doubles, which is why we're seeing a 7.0. Let me flip the order on that to make sure that it's actually working, right? In this case, X was the largest. Same numbers, but X is the largest. Our program accepts doubles, so we can come in here and enter double numbers, and it works perfectly fine. Okay, not too terribly difficult, right? Here's what I want to kind of show you. Here's where scope of a variable kind of plays into this. I have some duplicate code here. What do I mean? Well, all of this is ultimately the same. The only thing that's changing is X. All of this is ultimately the same. The only thing that's changing is y. I mean, like these two statements, lines 18 and 22, are effectively the same thing other than this variable. Okay, why does that matter? Well, duplicate code is not great. It's one of the things that you want to reduce. You kind of want to reduce that as much as possible. Not only is that, reduce errors, right? It makes the code easier to maintain, and it's just like big brain, right? It's like kind of a logical puzzle almost. So I'm going to bring in another variable called max. Notice that it is declared in the body of the main method. What it means is the scope of max is going to overlap into these bodies and stop existing here, right? This is the end of the main method. So max will continue to exist all the way there. And in fact, if we see this, x and y are overlapping into these bodies, right? Because here I'm actually referring to x, here I'm referring to y, and they exist, their scope overlaps into these bodies. What I'm going to do here with the if statement, instead of printing directly, I'm going to determine that x is greater than y, and what I'm going to do is take x and save it into max. I'm going to do a similar thing with y, and I'm going to cut this, right? I'm going to copy it and delete it with a cut operation. So if x is the largest, I'm going to save that into max. Otherwise, if I hit this, that means that y is the largest or it is equal, in which case I'll say the max is y. Then after the if statement is where my system.out.println is going to occur. All right, I'm going to say that the maximum is not x, not y, but whatever I saved into the variable max. Okay, this variable was declared in the main method. Its scope is going to overlap into this if-else. And then after that if-else is over, I can still access it because the scope of max coincides with the main method. It exists through all of this. Let's try this out. We should get the exact same thing. Right, the max of 3 and 7 is 7. I'm going to reverse that order. Still looking good. What if we have the same value? Not a problem. We're technically giving it y, but it's the same value. Okay, why is this better? Well, think about this. This is a little bit easier to maintain in the sense that if I want to change this annotation, for instance, right, I want to come in here and say the maximum value is I only have to change it in one spot, right? Beforehand, our previous version of this, we had this SOP, the system.out.println, duplicated in 2 spots effectively. Here, by minimizing duplicate code, I actually make my program easier to maintain. That's kind of the point of this. Okay, and it's with the introduction of this max variable. Now this is going to be super important for our next version of this, which is determining the maximum of 3. Right, the very next prompt, the very next slide says, write a program max of 3 that prompts the user to enter 3 numbers, then prints the largest of the 3 without using Math.max. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started on this one. Thinking. Yeah, I'll grab this. I'm going to copy all of my code here because as you can imagine, most of this is going to be duplicated, but I still want to have a separate folder. I'm going to right click on SRC, do a new Java class called max of 3. I'm going to highlight this, which by the way, Control A in Windows highlights all, A for all. And I'm going to paste over it my max of 2. Now, IntelliJ is rightfully mad at me because the name of this file is maxof3.java, but I have a max of 2 class. I'm going to just quickly rename this. Okay, so a lot of the same stuff. This program determines the maximum of 3 doubles. We got X, Y, we got Z. this is probably a good spot to pause if you want to attempt this one on your own. Now, I'm telling you, it's significantly harder than max of 2. This requires some logic. This requires some use of scope. Some of you may have already know about things like logical operators or nested if statements, and you don't need that. Right? I would like you to attempt this without using logical operators and nested if statements. If you don't know what that is, that's good, because that means you can't break my rule here. But I'm going to continue on. I want to figure out what is the max of 3 values. We can do this. We can do this using just what we know. Right? So if x is greater than y, the max is x. Otherwise, this becomes a little bit harder, but I can use my max of 2 kind of as a skeleton. All right? Check this out. I have max that's declared. If x is greater than y, I'm going to say that the max is x. So at this point, the value of max is either nothing or it's x. So what I want to do now is maybe compare max, right? Max, right? I need to determine what about y and z. I've already handled x. What about y and z? Well, I don't want to basically come in and say if, z is greater than x. I'm done with x at this point. What I want to compare y to is max. I gotta think about this for a second. Sorry, the reason why I'm like, is that max maybe doesn't have a value, right? Either the value that's in max is x or it's nothing. So I can't just take max, and maybe I need to bring back in my else statement. All right, let's leave that there. I'm handling x and y, right? So at this point, what's in max is either x or it's y. I need to now deal with z. And what I'm going to end up doing is I don't want to compare z to x. I don't want to compare z to y. At this point, I've actually determined what is the larger of those two. What I want to do is compare z to max. Right? At this point, max is either x or y, whatever the larger of that two is. I can ignore the other one at this point because it doesn't matter. The important step here is at this point to compare z, not to x, not to y, because I've already determined what is larger of the two. I want to compare z to max. If z turns out to be larger than max, well, the new max is now z. Okay, let's try this out. And we need to do several different test cases to make sure that our program is not just like arbitrarily choosing one. I'm going to right click in free space and tell it to run max of 3. Enter our first double. Let's go 2, 3, 4. Maximum is 4. Okay, but is z just getting saved into max? I need to kind of mix these values up. You really need to try every permutation of these, right? 2, 4, 3. Max is still 4. What about 4, 3, 2? Max is still 4. What about 4, 2, and 3? Okay, so if you attempted this without using this technique, I invite you to try every permutation to make sure. What do I mean? Well, the numbers have different values and they vary, and I want to make sure that I'm actually choosing the maximum value out of all of this. But what I want you to kind of recognize that all of this is actually kind of made possible due to this max variable. And the scope of this exists throughout all of this, right? It's declared in the body of the main method. If I try to declare max inside of these bodies, for one thing, we see why it's mad. Well, that's because max already exists. So the scope overlaps into these if statements, these if and if else statements. So trying to redeclare it, well, there's already a variable called max. If If I get rid of max, well, I got a problem like down here and here because max doesn't exist. In this case, it's declared inside the body of the if statement and it stops existing there. Okay, so we broaden the scope there. Now, one thing to keep in mind with broadening the scope is, what if you don't ever give it a value? Here I declared max, it's perfectly fine. IntelliJ made it gray because I never actually use it, right? I never actually do anything here. I never do anything here. Here it's mad because it doesn't have a value. What if we got rid of this if statement? Well, now here it's mad for the exact same reason. It was declared but never initialized. So that's one thing you do have to be careful about. Now, with that being said, we could kind of reduce this a little bit, right? I have double max. What if the moment that I declared max, I figured out what is the larger of the two? That is, I say that the max is equal to, I'm going to start out by saying it's x. Nope, I'm going to start out by saying it's y. Then I'm going to ask, is x actually greater than y? Right away, I assume that the maximum is y. If x turns out to be better, bigger, more maximum, I save x in. When I get to this point, the same things effectively occurred. Either x is saved into max because it turned out to be larger, or that wasn't true and y is still there, right? So I effectively got rid of the else by actually assigning a value right away. So that's another way to kind of reduce a little bit of code. Now, all this being said, what we're emulating is the Math.max method. So I would like to show you one last thing. Why don't I just kind of delete this? Like, one of the problems with Math.max is that we can't do 3 values, right? I want to do the maximum of x, y, and z. Well, Math.max only works with 2 values, x and y. So I can determine the maximum of x and y. But following a lot of our logic here is, what if I determine the maximum of the 2 values, then I take whatever that is and then compare it to my third. Okay, so what if I said max of x and y, and then I change the value of max to be the max of whatever the maximum is in z. This is effectively what our if statements were doing just a moment ago, right? I determine the maximum of these 2 values, I save that into max. On the next line, I'm going to determine the maximum of these 2 values, right? Keep in mind that max should have the larger of x and y. I then compare the larger of x and y to z. I then save that into max. So when I get to this point, what should be in max is my largest value, and we'll do just one quick test case with a maybe 3, 4, 2, and see that the maximum is 4. Last little big brain thing, this could actually be reduced to just one line, one statement effectively. Right? I have the maximum of x and y. This is going to return a value. What I have highlighted is a double. Okay, let's take that and then compare it to z. I can only provide 2 values for Math.max. I'm doing that here in this call. That is going to give me back the largest of x and y, whatever the maximum is. I then compare the maximum of x and y to z. So this call to Math.max only has 2 values. Bit convoluted, hard to see. This is effectively nesting. But that's going to be it for scope of a variable. I'll see you in the next one.